You can't just sell it, Mom. That house is ours too. My son Daniel stood in my kitchen, arms crossed, his voice tight in a way I'd rarely heard from him before. My daughter Patricia sat at the table, not saying anything, but her silence was its own kind of argument. Behind them, through the window, I could see the oak tree their father had planted the same week Daniel was born, 41 years earlier. I remember not answering right away. I simply poured myself a glass of water and let the silence sit there between us for a long moment before I finally said quietly, "It was never ours, Daniel. It was mine and your father's been gone 6 years now." That wasn't the answer either of them wanted. I could see it in the way Patricia's jaw tightened, the exact same way it did when she was 12 years old and didn't get her way about something. But it was the truth, and at 72 years old, I'd finally reached a point in my life where I was done softening the truth simply to keep a room comfortable. My name is Eleanor. I'm 73 now, though I was 72 the year everything I'm about to tell you actually happened. I want to walk you through exactly how I ended up selling the house my two children genuinely believed they had some claim to, and how that single decision led me somewhere I never once imagined for myself. My husband Frank and I bought that house in 1979, a modest four-bedroom colonial in a quiet suburb outside Philadelphia, back when Daniel was still in diapers and Patricia was barely a thought. We raised both of them there. Frank died in that house too, in the upstairs bedroom, 6 years ago now, after a long illness that both of us saw coming and neither of us ever fully prepared for. After Frank passed, both kids started talking about the house differently, almost immediately, in ways I don't think either of them fully realized at the time. Daniel would mention, almost casually, how his own kids loved visiting Grandma's house, how it would be nice if it stayed in the family. Patricia, going through her own divorce around that same time, started bringing up how much space I had, how she and her two children could really use a place like this eventually. I want to be honest that I understood where both of them were coming from. Neither of my children were being cruel or calculating. They loved that house because it held their entire childhood inside its walls, every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday dinner that made up an entire life. What they didn't fully understand, not yet, was that those same walls had started to feel less like a home to me and more like a museum I was quietly, exhaustedly maintaining for memories that belonged more to them now than to me. If you're watching this tonight with your own version of a house or a decision that your own family believes they have some claim to, I want you to stay with me, because I promise you, what I eventually chose to do with that house wasn't about rejecting my children. It was about something I hadn't fully understood I needed until I finally, quietly, gave myself permission to need it. If this is resonating with you already, go ahead and hit like right now. It genuinely helps this story reach someone who might need to hear it tonight. And if you want to know exactly where that difficult decision eventually led me, subscribe, because I promise you, it wasn't where anyone in my family expected. I had no idea, standing in that kitchen with my son's arms crossed and my daughter's silent disappointment filling the room, that within a year, both of them would understand something about that decision that neither of us could have possibly predicted that particular afternoon. I think it's worth explaining exactly what that house actually meant to each of my children, because I don't want this story to sound like they were simply being selfish or entitled about a piece of property. That wasn't the reality of it, not entirely, and I think the truth is considerably more complicated than that. Daniel had his own family by then, a wife, two children, a comfortable enough life in a townhouse about 20 minutes away, but his youngest, my granddaughter Sophie, had essentially grown up in that house's backyard, learning to ride her first bicycle on the same driveway where Daniel had learned his. Every Christmas, every Easter, every ordinary summer weekend, that house had become the fixed point around which their entire family calendar revolved. Daniel wasn't wrong to feel attached to it. He'd built genuine memories there, memories that belonged to him as much as they belonged to me. Patricia's situation carried a different kind of weight entirely. Her divorce had left her in a considerably more precarious financial position than she'd ever expected to find herself in at 44 years old, splitting custody of her two children, working to rebuild a career she'd stepped away from for over a decade. The house, to her, represented something closer to genuine security, a fallback, a place that could eventually become hers and the children's if circumstances required it. I don't believe she was being calculating when she mentioned it. I believe she was genuinely frightened, in the particular way divorce can leave a person frightened, and that house had become, in her mind, a kind of safety net she hadn't quite realized she was counting on until I started talking seriously about selling it. I want to be honest that for the first year or two after Frank died, I didn't think seriously about selling at all. The house felt like the last physical place where I could still feel him nearby, his workshop in the garage, exactly as he'd left it, his reading glasses still sitting on the nightstand for longer than I probably should admit. Selling it during those early years would have felt like a second loss layered directly on top of the first one. What actually changed wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was smaller and more gradual than that. I started noticing how much of my own life had quietly narrowed down to maintaining that house rather than actually living inside it. The gutters needed cleaning every autumn, a task Frank used to handle without a second thought that now required me to hire someone and worry every single time about whether they'd done it properly. The upstairs bathroom hadn't been renovated since 1995, and every time something broke, which felt like increasingly often, I found myself doing math about repair costs against a fixed income that wasn't growing to match them. By my 72nd birthday, I sat alone at that same kitchen table, looking around at 4 bedrooms, only one of which I actually used, and asked myself a question I hadn't let myself seriously consider in longer than I care to admit. Was I actually still living my own life in this house, or had I simply become its caretaker, holding it in trust for 2 grown children who each had entirely different, entirely reasonable, entirely separate ideas about what it should eventually become? I made the actual decision on a Tuesday afternoon in March, sitting alone in Frank's old workshop, surrounded by tools he'd never use again, tools I'd never once learned to use myself. I remember picking up his favorite hammer, the one with the worn wooden handle he'd replaced himself twice over the decades, and thinking, quite clearly, that I was tired of being the sole custodian of a museum built entirely around a life that had already, quietly, ended. I called a realtor the following morning, before I'd even told either of my children what I was seriously considering. I want to be honest about that particular choice, because I think it matters. I didn't want their reactions influencing a decision I needed to make clearly, on my own terms, for reasons that were genuinely about me rather than about managing their feelings in advance. I told Daniel first, over the phone, on a Sunday evening roughly 2 weeks later. There was a long silence before he said anything at all. "Mom, are you serious right now? Sophie's going to be devastated." I told him I understood that, and that I genuinely was sorry for the disruption it would cause her, but that the house wasn't actually mine to preserve indefinitely for his daughter's future memories. He didn't respond well to that particular framing, not initially. "So we don't get any say in this at all? After everything Dad built there?" Patricia's reaction, when I told her the following day, carried a different, sharper edge to it. "Mom, you know my situation. You know how tight things are right now. Were you even going to ask us before you just decided this?" I told her, as gently as I could manage, that asking would have meant treating my own home as something that required her permission, and that I genuinely didn't believe that was the correct arrangement for either of us going forward. The confrontation that actually brought both of them to my kitchen happened about a week later, the scene I described at the very beginning of this story. Daniel's crossed arms, Patricia's tight, disappointed silence. I remember Daniel saying, quite directly, "This feels like you're punishing us for something, Mom. I don't understand what we did wrong here." I told him, honestly, that neither of them had done anything wrong at all, that this decision genuinely wasn't about punishment or rejection in any sense. It was about a house that had slowly become too large, too expensive, and too heavy with quiet, complicated grief for me to keep carrying alone into whatever years I actually had left. If you're sitting with your own version of this exact conversation tonight, family members who love you but who've quietly started treating your own decisions as if they require collective family approval, I want you to know this particular tension is far more common than any of us tend to openly discuss. Comment below and tell me what decision in your own life you're currently being asked to justify to people who love you, because I read every single comment, and I think there's real value in naming that tension honestly, the way I finally learned to here. The conversation ended without any real resolution that particular afternoon. Daniel left without hugging me goodbye, something he'd never once done before in his entire adult life. Patricia stayed a few minutes longer, quietly crying at the kitchen table, telling me she simply didn't understand how I could do this to them. I sat with her while she cried, genuinely sorry for her pain, but I didn't change my mind. Not that day, and honestly, not in the difficult weeks that followed either. The house sold faster than I actually expected, within 6 weeks, to a young couple expecting their first child, who asked, almost shyly, if the oak tree in the backyard had a story behind it. I told them it did, that Frank had planted it the same week our son was born, and that I hoped it would grow just as tall over their own family's years there as it had over ours. I want to be honest that packing up 45 years of accumulated life was considerably harder than making the actual decision to sell had been. Frank's workshop took me nearly a full week alone, sorting tools I didn't recognize the purpose of, deciding what genuinely deserved keeping against what had simply been sitting there, unused, for longer than either of us had probably realized while he was still alive to use it. Daniel came by exactly once during the packing process, ostensibly to help, though the visit felt more like quiet surveillance than actual assistance. He walked through each room slowly, running his hand along door frames, standing for a long moment in his old bedroom before saying anything at all. "I keep thinking about Sophie's face when I tell her grandma's house is gone," he said quietly, not quite looking at me. I told him the house wasn't actually gone, simply that it belonged to a different family now, the way it had once belonged to us before that. He didn't respond to that particular distinction, and I didn't push him to. Patricia's goodbye to the house happened alone, without me there to witness it. I came home one afternoon during the final packing week to find a note on the kitchen counter, in her familiar handwriting, saying simply that she'd stopped by to say her own private goodbye, and that she hoped I knew what I was doing. I sat with that note for a long time before finally setting it aside. The last night in that house, I slept in my own bedroom for the final time, surrounded by boxes, the walls stripped bare of 4 decades of photographs. I let myself cry properly that night, not for the decision itself, which I still believed completely in, but for the specific, ordinary Tuesday evenings that had happened inside those particular walls, evenings I was about to permanently leave behind. Daniel drove me to the airport 3 weeks later, after I'd made the considerably larger decision to relocate entirely, rather than simply downsize locally, a choice that had genuinely surprised even me during the research process. Neither of us spoke much during that particular drive, though the silence felt somewhat softer than it had during our earlier confrontation, less angry, more resigned to something neither of us could fully name yet. At the curb, he hugged me, briefly but genuinely, and said, "I still don't fully understand this, Mom, but I hope it's actually what you need." The flight to Manila felt endless in the way only a first solo international trip at 72 can feel. Plenty of time, somewhere over the Pacific, to seriously wonder whether I'd made an enormous, irreversible mistake, one considerably larger than simply selling a house. Walking through the Manila airport after landing, the heat met me before I'd even fully cleared the terminal doors, thick and immediate, in a way nothing back in Pennsylvania had ever prepared me for. I stood there for a moment, took a slow breath, and said quietly to myself, "Well, Eleanor, there's genuinely no house to go back to now, whatever happens next." The small apartment I'd arranged, sight unseen except through photographs, sat in a quiet residential area outside Metro Manila, modest but clean, considerably smaller than any single floor of the house I'd just sold. As I unpacked that first evening, exhausted well beyond simple jet lag, I sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed and felt something close to genuine panic settle into my chest for the first time since I'd made the entire decision. Nobody had adequately prepared me for the specific weight of that first night's silence, a silence made considerably heavier by the knowledge that, unlike some difficult decisions, this particular one carried no easy undo button. There was no house waiting back home for me to quietly return to if this didn't work out. I'd made certain of that myself, deliberately, and sitting there that first night, I genuinely questioned whether that certainty had been wisdom or simply stubbornness dressed up convincingly as courage. By the fourth day, forcing myself simply to leave the apartment for something beyond absolute necessity, I walked to a small market 2 streets over, mostly to prove to myself that I still could function in this unfamiliar place I'd chosen. I had no real idea what I was looking for among the unfamiliar fruits and vegetables when a woman at a small produce stall noticed my obvious confusion and, without my asking, gently guided me towards something I'd never once seen before, patiently showing me, through simple gestures, exactly how to eat it. Her name, I'd eventually learn, was Davina. That first morning, she didn't do anything I could call remarkable in any objective sense. She simply treated a confused, elderly foreign stranger with genuine, unhurried patience, the specific kind of patience that costs a person nothing to give, and yet felt, in that particular moment, like the most valuable thing anyone had offered me in longer than I could easily remember. I went back to her stall the following morning, and the morning after that. By the end of that first difficult week, Davina had started setting aside specific items she'd noticed, entirely on her own, that I seemed to genuinely prefer, without my ever having said a single word about my preferences directly to her. There was an older security guard at a nearby building, a man named Ramon, who greeted every single person who passed his post with the same unhurried warmth, whether they were a resident, a delivery driver, or simply someone passing through. The first time he remembered my name without me repeating it, nearly 3 weeks in, I actually stopped walking on the sidewalk, quietly overwhelmed by how much that small, ordinary recognition mattered to me after everything I'd deliberately left behind. By the second month, I had a small, genuine routine for the first time since Frank had died: market mornings with Davina, Ramon's steady greeting at the gate, an evening exercise class along a nearby boulevard where a woman named Corazon began saving me a seat without either of us ever formally discussing it. None of this was extraordinary in any objective sense. All of it, taken together, quietly became something I hadn't fully realized I'd been genuinely missing until it was finally, unexpectedly, being given back to me. Daniel visited around the 6-month mark, staying 8 days, arriving with an expression I can only describe as cautiously skeptical, the look of a man prepared to gather evidence for a conversation he'd clearly been rehearsing since he'd booked the flight. I understood that particular posture completely, and I didn't take it personally. On his 3rd day, I took him to Davina's market stall without explaining anything about her in advance. She greeted me warmly by name, asked how my week had been, and handed me a piece of fruit she'd apparently been saving specifically for my visit that morning. Daniel watched this entire exchange with a quiet, careful attention I hadn't expected from him. Walking back toward the apartment afterward, he was silent for almost an entire block before finally saying, "She knows your name. She actually remembers what you like." I told him she did. Another block passed before he spoke again. "I guess I pictured you sitting alone in some small apartment somewhere, Mom." Isolated. I didn't picture any of this. On his 6th day, Ramon greeted Daniel by name at the gate, having learned it simply from overhearing our conversations days earlier, and I watched something visibly shift behind my son's eyes, a kind of quiet, uncomfortable recalibration happening in real time. That evening, sitting together on my small balcony, Daniel was unusually quiet for a long stretch before he finally said, "I think I assumed selling the house meant you were giving something up, losing something. I didn't consider you might actually be gaining something instead." I asked him, gently, What had genuinely surprised him most about the visit? He thought about it seriously before answering. Honestly, how much more like yourself you seem here than you did those last couple years in the house. I didn't want to see that while we were fighting about it, but I can't really unsee it now that I have. Patricia visited 3 months later, arriving with considerably more open skepticism than Daniel had, understandably given her own precarious financial situation and the security she'd genuinely lost when I'd sold the house. But by her fourth day, watching me navigate the market, chat comfortably with Davina in a mix of English and increasingly competent Tagalog, greet Ramon by name at the gate, something in her posture began, slowly, to soften. "I was angry at you for a long time, Mom," she admitted on her final evening, sitting together on that same small balcony. "I felt like you'd taken away something I was counting on, without really asking how it would affect me. I told her I understood that anger completely, and that I hadn't made the decision to hurt her, but I also hadn't made it primarily to protect her either. I know that now," she said quietly. "I think I needed to actually see you here, happy in a way I hadn't seen in years, to really understand that this wasn't about rejecting us. It was about you finally choosing something for yourself. I want to be honest about how things actually stand with my children now, because I think a tidy, fully resolved ending would do this story a genuine disservice. Daniel and Patricia both understand my decision considerably better than they did that difficult afternoon in my kitchen, but understanding isn't quite the same thing as complete peace, and I don't want to pretend those two things are identical. Patricia still occasionally mentions, usually in passing, how different her own situation might look if that house had remained available to her during those hardest post-divorce years. I don't dismiss that feeling when it surfaces. It's genuinely valid, and I don't believe my own peace requires her to fully release every complicated feeling she still carries about a decision that undeniably affected her life too, not just mine. What actually changed, gradually over that first year, was something quieter than complete resolution. Daniel calls most weeks now, and when he does, the conversations carry a depth I hadn't experienced with him in years, considerably less about logistics and grievances, considerably more about how we're each actually doing. He brought Sophie to visit this past spring, and watching my granddaughter chase Ramon's small dog around the courtyard, genuinely delighted, I understood something important. She didn't need that specific house in Pennsylvania to have a meaningful relationship with me. She simply needed access to a grandmother who was genuinely, fully present, wherever that grandmother happened to be living. I think about that kitchen confrontation often now, Daniel's crossed arms, Patricia's tight, disappointed silence. I don't regret the decision that caused it, not even slightly, but I've come to understand something important about that particular kind of family tension. My children weren't entirely wrong to feel attached to that house, and I wasn't wrong to recognize that my own remaining years couldn't continue being organized around preserving it indefinitely for memories that, however genuine, belonged considerably more to their childhood than to whatever life I actually had left to build for myself. If there's one genuine lesson this entire experience has taught me, it's this. Love and inheritance aren't always the same conversation, even when families desperately want them to be. You can love your children completely, want everything genuinely good for them, and still, at 73 years old, decide that your own remaining life doesn't owe itself entirely to preserving a physical structure for their eventual benefit, particularly when that structure has quietly stopped being a home and started becoming simply a museum you're exhaustedly maintaining alone. I am 73 years old now. I still think about that house sometimes, the oak tree Frank planted, his workshop I never fully learned to use myself. But I don't regret selling it, and I've stopped needing my children's complete, unconditional approval of that particular decision to genuinely believe it was the correct one. If tonight's story meant something to you, whether your own family is currently asking you to justify a decision that's genuinely yours alone to make, or you're simply wondering if it's too late to choose something entirely for yourself at your particular age, please hit like before you go. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach the people who might actually need to hear it. And if you want to keep following exactly where this particular chapter goes from here, subscribe, because there's considerably more of this life I haven't told you about yet. I'd love to know in the comments what decision in your own life you're currently being asked to justify to the people who love you, because I read every single one, and I think naming it honestly, the way I finally learned to here, is genuinely where things begin to change. I sold the house my kids wanted, and I moved to the Philippines instead. It wasn't a rejection of them. It was, finally, at 72 years old, a genuine choice for myself.